Good afternoon. Welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name's Charles Godfrey. I'm the director. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to another in our series of talks on evolving economic thought. And our speaker this evening is Danny Dorling, Professor Danny Dorling, who is a Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at the School of Geography here. And Danny has been in Oxford since 2013, grew up in Oxford, and before that was at Sheffield for 10 years. And Danny works on a huge number of different things, but issues around social inequality, housing, health, employment, education, poverty, and many other things. And he also co-founded the internet-based World Mapper project. Danny's talking this afternoon on Is the Human Species Slowing Down? Danny, come and give us your talk.
Well, thank you for coming. It's a very arrogant title. You're not going to get the answer in the next 40 minutes, but at least I can promise you it won't be longer than 40 minutes because I'm interested in what you've got to say. It's a book I've been working on and off for 6 years. It is not quite finished. I'm 4 weeks away from the end of it. So you can absolutely wreck my next 4 weeks if you point out the fundamental problem. And I'm going to talk to you a lot about demography, because this is where I'm more sure, and I'm far from the first person to point this out. Darrell Bricker and John Ibbotson have done very well in a book which has been published in numerous languages around the world, January and February this year, entitled Empty Planet, about demographic slowing. And if it wasn't for demographic slowing, I wouldn't be talking about this. What I do is collect data, lots of data on almost everything I can measure. And for slowdown, it's very, very simple. I work out the speed at which it's changing, and I find it's slowing down. Almost everything that you can measure, and this is the problem, because my worry is that there are things you can't measure which are speeding up, but almost everything you can measure appears at the moment to be slowing. And the question is, if that's true, what does it tell us? This man, Charles Darwin, amazingly, in The Origin of Species, described a population explosion. He was talking, I think, about elephants, and talking about what happened when there were a few favourable seasons and foodstuff was plentiful and so on, and how the size of a population could suddenly explode. And the irony was that he was writing this just as the thing began for his own species. He wasn't aware it was beginning for human beings, but we've had a population explosion that I'm sure you're aware of. And now it's been slowing down for some time. The only thing which is still rising and not slowing down that I can measure, and you can certainly, it's a wonderful day out there, is the air temperature. The surface temperature of the planet is not only rising, but it's actually rising at a slightly accelerating rate, which obviously preoccupies you. Lots of other things are going up, but they're not going up as fast as they were. Here's the basic graph. This is a book I wrote 6 years ago called Population 10 Billion. And this is a graph of the first derivative, which just means the change. It's global population. It was rising 1820s, 1830s, 1840s by less than 0.5%. That fall, by the way, that slowdown in the rate of growth was associated with what happens when we and others went into Africa. The acceleration globally begins around about 1850. By 1910, you've got world population growing at 1% a year. The four horsemen of the apocalypse intervene at various points. A pandemic, more important than the First World War, was tiny from a global point of view. It wasn't really a world war, but the pandemic was much bigger. The flu pandemic in 1919, you can see the effect. The Second World War, much bigger world war. The soldiers return, and also crucially at the time of this world war, shortly afterwards, India gets independence, enormous disruption in India, millions of people forced to move between Pakistan and India. China has a revolution, and world population growth quickly moves up to over 2% a year. 2% a year in the 1960s was obviously unsustainable, obvious only to a few statisticians and a lovely mathematician who worked out that in just a couple of 100 years, the entire planet would be a seething mass of bodies if it were to continue. Peaks sometime between 1968 and 1971. And then the rate begins to go down. You're only seeing the beginning of the go down there, because this book was published 6 years ago and the data was older than that. The little blip, that kind of spike, like looks like a heart attack towards the end, was principally the East African famine. Whenever things go bad for human beings, we have more babies. Anyway, this is old news. These are the rates of growth of different continents. And again, this is what we knew around about 2013. And what we, or more appropriately the UN, thought was going to happen. And all the continents, bar Africa, heading towards that zero line. It's a slowdown. Africa's a really interesting one. A paper came out in February of this year in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is one of the first papers I've seen that's helped explain partly why fertility decline in Africa wasn't as fast as in other continents. And it's very crude to put it, but I'll tell you it just in a nutshell. It is possible that the intervention of the IMF and the World Bank and structural adjustment had an effect in Africa in the 80s and 90s, and more recently that meant that girls' education was damaged by what happened on the continent, and young women had more babies, and now that has ended, we have a fertility decline acceleration. But if anybody wants to complain about the number of people on the continent of Africa, we need to think very carefully about what was it that happened in the 80s and 90s, particularly to do with debt, that may have had an effect. But that's the reference. I'm going to go through these slides very quickly, not least because this is recorded, so if you're fascinated by any of this, you've got a chance to look back. And also, most of you will not find most of these slides interesting, and I have too many slides. This is the second derivative of change. Apologies if you don't know what a derivative of change is, but this is a change in change from the UN projections, and these were the UN projections as of 2011. And you have reality up until about 2011, and then you have the projections going forward. Now, clearly that isn't going to happen. It's not suddenly going to go smooth, but demographers can't really be that exciting. What I did is drew that. This is 6 years ago. Why did I draw that? Because I think what we're looking at is a series of population booms. The gap between those peaks was 18 years, then 21 years. Human beings are not elephants, we're not flies. We do things that we used to do worldwide every 18 years, now every 21 years. We do it in this country every 31 years now. You can make it look more sophisticated if you just copy the pattern from the past onwards, and you end up with a planet at 9.3 billion people by 2060. I hid this 300 pages into that book so that nobody would criticize me. I'm just pointing it out now because it's kind of becoming more accepted that we may not get to the current UN projection is 11.2 billion by the end of the century. The UN will revise this year, possibly as early as the end of June, their projection. They revise it every 2 years. It'll come down from 11.2 billion, and people are going to ask why. And part of the reason why is it should never have gone up to 11.2 billion. Here's that graph again, but now with the actual population on it. And so they were saying 10 billion. On the day, I think, of the publication of that book called Population 10 Billion, the United Nations demographer announced they thought it was going to be 11, just to annoy me, which is why I'm kind of happy it's going down. Ridiculous graph, I'm just trying to show you things. This is GDP falling everywhere. We've known this for 2 or 3 decades, but those darker cells are parts of the world and the rate of GDP growth not going up. It's slowing down. One more book, With Stuart Geetle-Baston of This Manor, formerly, we wrote in 2018 a more detailed book about demography, fertility, and everything that's going on. I'm going to get off demography in a minute. The graphs get more complicated, right? The new graphs, I'm allowed 65 of them. I negotiate graphs when I do book contracts, not advances, are phase portraits. Phase portraits, how many people know what a phase portrait is? A few? Great, okay, we've got a smattering. There you've got a picture of a pendulum, goes from side to side. In the middle you've got a graph over time, which you're used to, and it's showing the position of the pendulum. It goes to one side, then the other side, and it's showing the velocity. When the pendulum's right at one side, the velocity goes to 0. When it's in the middle, the velocity is at the maximum, it slows down. So the velocity and the position are doing different things. If you put velocity on one axis and position on another, you get a phase diagram. And you're about to see probably about 40 phase diagrams very, very quickly. Okay? Remember, the title of this lecture series is Evolving Economic Thought. And this is evolving. Here's a really simple one. If you don't get this, I'm afraid the next half an hour is going to be abysmal for you. This is a country which has 100 million people in 1950. It is growing at a rate of 2%. 2% every year. So 1951 it has 102 million. Along the x-axis is the absolute increase in people. Along the y-axis is the total number of people. And you'll see that by 1985 it's got 200 million. By 2006 it's got 300 million. By 2020 it's getting faster. It's got 400 million. So on one of these diagrams, that's what an acceleration of growth looks like. 2% growth a year. And there's a quote from Darwin. Numerous recorded cases of the astonishing rapid increase of various animals in a state of nature when circumstances have been favourable to them during 2 or 3 following seasons. Here is a slowdown. And again, we're starting with 100 million people in 1950. And again, we're starting with a 2% population growth rate. But every year, we're going to take that down by 0.1%. So 1951, it drops to 1.9. 1952, it drops to 1.8%, and so on. By 1970, you've got 0 growth. So it's bang on the middle of the axis. And then it's a little bit like the book Children of Men. You kind of, or the film, if you've seen that, we're heading down towards 0. That's what a rapid deceleration. I'll do questions later. A pointer. I can't. The problem is there's 2 screens. I can't because I've got too many graphs, so I'll never get to the end. This is not a well-honed presentation. This is in the middle of thinking. This is what stability looks like. For those of you who are particularly geeky, it's the miraculous spiral. This one is oscillating at around every 31 years. 31.4159, which you may recognise. It also happens to currently be the average age at which Europeans are having their babies. That spiral on a normal graph looks like that. And I've written a kind of Daily Mail story about the terrible population increase and decline that is. Okay, let's get towards some real data. This is babies in the world. Those of you who like Hans Rosling and what he used to do might remember Hans Rosling talking about peak baby in 1990. It's almost correct. He was almost correct. Unfortunately, 2015, we've just managed to peak 1990, but it's absolutely going to go down. Right. Some things which are not population. You're going to get loads of population later. But the reason I'm excited about this is I tried to write a chapter for this book about things that are still speeding up. And they were all slowing down. And when that happens, it's when you get what you don't expect to get that you begin to think, well, something's going on here. So you have to read the y-axis to know what these graphs are. The first of these 2 graphs is total United States student debt. It is still rising. By about 2012, it had passed the trillion mark. It is currently at the $1.5 trillion mark. But the point is, and it depends how you can see it, it was accelerating up to 2009, And can you see the graph is kind of leading the other way? I'm afraid this is one of these talks where I'm going to try and convince you. That's still rising, but it's slowing down. It peaks every October because that's when you turn up in college full of hope and with your enormous debt in the United States. The second graph is the total car loan debt in the United States, which of course crashed in 2008 with the financial crash. The car companies were not car companies, they were debt companies, which just kind of debt companies with an automobile attached to them. But again, you can see at 2018, quarter four, we're on that zero line for the amount of money that Americans are borrowing to buy their cars. Mortgage debt, okay, still completely in the doldrums, but I'm going to show you later some UK data on that. Total US public debt, and there maybe you have to be a bit hopeful to kind of see the thing veering towards zero. It's always about still rising, but rising more slowly. It cannot carry on going up forever. At some point, the Chinese will stop sending refrigerators, and the Americans will not be able to issue debt to buy them. The question is when, how fast? Wikipedia. Wikipedia begins around about 2001. The number of articles accelerate and accelerate to a maximum acceleration in 2007, because there's a limit to how many things you can describe that it's actually worth doing. And it carries on rising, but at a slower rate. 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014. Somebody has a clever idea of inventing stubs, and then you're invited on Wikipedia to actually write another definition of something, and that manages to get a little bit of acceleration, 2015, but slowing down again. There's a limited number of things. I'm trying to get lots more data about the total size of the cloud, all these kind of things. For every one of these graphs, I'm getting another 10 or 12 data sets to kind of confirm. I should say, I think he's probably in the audit, Max Rosa, who's based in this place, his data is unbelievable, and he gets data from people. This graph of a dramatic slowdown is book production in the Netherlands. But we have to check book production in every country. Now, of course, book production is slowing down. There were lovely stories with these graphs. I have a feeling that book production was at its maximum acceleration in the 1970s and 80s because you showed off by how many books you had in your house. You couldn't possibly read them all. And then other things come along, and it does that. And the lovely thing about this data set, it actually begins at the time of the printing press, is you can actually see when people decide to burn books, because publishers get a bit reticent to publish in the years immediately after all the books are piled up outside a cathedral and burned for heresy. Okay, things which are not slowing down. Climate change. Asda, Walmart, kindly produced this graph, this particular illustration. What is a gigaton? It's 1 billion metric tons, because we're going to be talking about billions of tons of CO2. It's equal to 100 million, I think it's African elephants, the decaying carcasses of 6 million blue whales. It's the big numbers. Here, since 1750, are the estimates of the rise in CO2 emissions over time. And I will ignore the older data, although it's fascinating, and I'll just look at the graph from 1960 onwards. And the problem is that for most of the time, it's on the accelerating side. It's going up from 10 billion tons in 1960 to 20 billion tons by 1979 to over 35 billion tons a year now, worldwide, being admitted CO2. The Rio, Kyoto and Paris agreements look a bit miserable on this graph because I do wonder whether governments kind of think, oh, didn't we do a great thing? We came together and made that agreement. Because after each one, there's actually an acceleration of pollution. And currently we're at an acceleration. Now the good news, and it's desperately kind of sad good news, is that the doubling time of worldwide CO2 emissions has gone from 22 years, doubling every 22 years, to 23. I mean, it's pathetic, and for something to hang on to, it's not great. And we're all it's game over if you don't do something dramatic with that. So yes, admissions are still going up ridiculously. This is what the graph looks like when it's drawn normally. In case you're wondering, why is he playing with these weird graphs? Exactly the same data. You should find the traditional graph very, very easy to understand. Right? The problem with a traditional graph is it hides all the really exciting thing, which is it going up faster or slower than it was going up before, in a tiny amount of space of the graph. Whereas the graph that I've drawn, which physicists draw and so on, and I'll end by showing you that social scientists in Japan have been doing this for over 20 years, just we're a bit slow. What the graph which shows the rate of change as well as the absolute amount does is put all the emphasis on the direction to try and give you a clue. Temperature. It will get simpler in a minute. 3 different time series of temperature. One is the NASA Space Goddard series. The other is the Met Office Adjusted series. It depends on the datum point. So one of them is comparing to the 1951-2018 average, where we are almost 1 degree over it. The other is comparing to a 1961-2018 norm, where obviously we're much more nearer because the norm includes now. But all the 2018 points are worrying because it's accelerating. Not just going up, it's actually over there on the side. But have a look back at 2008, 1990, 1982. Global recessions are the best thing you can hope for actually not seeing a rise in CO2 emissions. The last graph. I have a dear old friend who doesn't believe in climate change, who sent me this data. And this data comes from the satellite estimates. So it only begins in 1979, and it's all over the place. So you can look at that and think, oh dear, that's a bit worrying. I'm now going to show you it on a normal graph. So, somebody who doesn't believe in climate change sends me that data, and you draw it on a normal graph and you go, it's heating up, isn't it? So why does it look like a mess on the graph I draw? Exactly the same data. Because of things like 1998. Something went wrong in the readings from the satellites in 1998. And if you draw the rate of change, it really highlights that 1998 is very, very exciting. But even the data that people who tell you that climate change isn't happening shows that climate change is happening. People. I'm going to show you quite a lot now about numbers of people and numbers of babies, because this is very recent and I think interesting. This little lad is wearing a Superman cape given to him by students from the University of Sheffield when they were visiting the refugee camp in Lesbos a few years ago, worrying about numbers of people. Here's the global figures, the current latest UN figures on total world population. So around about 1930, you've got 2 billion. Round about now, you've got heading towards 8 billion. And the projections, this is the current projections, not the ones we should expect to get soon, show it peaking shortly after 2100. Right, that's a slowdown. That's well known. The exciting thing is just, is it going to slow down faster than that or not? The other graph you can see there is exactly the same data, but with 2 log scales, which helps you realise that turning up in the Americas with your diseases is devastating. Going into Africa with your wonderful civilization is devastating. And what's great at the moment, the current slowdown is not about disease or war or slavery. It's about women saying no to men, to put it quite crudely. The United States. So we've drawn a wall. We've tried to make these diagrams a bit more exciting, because I know all of you are loving the fact that you're having to see all these graphs, but you know, for every graph you put into a book, you halve the number of sales. There's the United States. It's slowing down quite slowly. Here's China. And of course, China's slowing down dramatically, quickly. not just because of the one-child policy. It was slowing down well before that. They've relaxed the one-child policy, and hey, people have got used to having one child, it turns out. Africa, the whole of Africa treated as one, goes from well over 1 billion now to, in theory, well over 4 billion by the end of this century, but probably not, given what we know most recently. And next to Africa, I've put the piddling, dramatically unimportant British Isles, just in case you're interested. If you want to know why, by the way, it really matters what we did to Ireland in the 1840s, just have a look at that. It's the British Isles, including Ireland. Or alternatively, if you want to know whether our invitation in 2003, we're good at doing these invitations. Enoch Powell went and did it to the Caribbean and to India in the 1960s. Please come, we need you. In 2003, we issued an invitation to Eastern Europe, and we said, please can you come, we need you. It's called opening up to the A8 early. They came, and we did it again. And okay, it's a big spike. We were lucky to get it. It's going now. They're not coming anymore. That's where we're heading. But we are a piffling little country that is of relatively unimportance in this world. India. And these are the estimates from the UN of India before the UN revises its figures, which will be an even faster slowdown of this, peaking in 2064. Japan, small country, and ahead, just ahead in so many things, and ahead in population slowdown. All the text is there for anybody who's particularly fascinated, but every little tweak on these is a story. There's a story about a war or an embargo or something else. This is the rest of Euro-Asia, so the rest of Europe and Asia, but taking out China, Japan and India, because I've already showed them. And again, slowing down very rapidly. Oceania, which is mainly Australia and New Zealand, again, slowing down. The USA again. Oh, sorry, no, the Americas without the USA first. The Americas without the USA are slowing down faster than the USA. I've put the USA back up there so you can compare. It's stunning. This is total population. These figures have been out for years now, so I'm not really showing you anything that exciting. I'll hopefully speed up and get onto that. Babies. This is total fertility rates, which have their issues because sometimes people have their babies earlier than later. We've put some birds on. There's a stork. But as I go through this, the birds will change to the national bird of each country. I'm trying to be sort of less Eurocentric. But anyway, 1960 in the world, the average woman was having 5 children. Bang, slowdown comes in. Fastest deceleration in the 60s through to the 70s. By 1976, you dropped to 4. By 1992, you dropped to 3. 2016, we're looking around about 2.4. The second graph here is zooming in on those last few years. And the really exciting thing is 2014, 15, and 16, which are the latest years for which we can get what we think is accurate data. And it's moved away from the axis, which means that the rate of slowdown of fertility is accelerating, so it's going down even faster than before. You may think I'm obsessed by this, and I know I am a bit obsessive, but tiny changes in the wiggle of this graph alters the population at the end of this century, in just 81 years, by 1 billion, 1.5 billion people. And it is much easier to have a happier world, I suspect, with fewer people. Bald eagle for the United States, up at well over 3.5 children in the 1960s. The pill comes along, magical thing, zoom down and down and down, and then kind of get locked in this spiral around about 2 children. The US has the highest fertility of the rich world. I've zoomed in again if you're kind of obsessive about it, but just look at 2016, we're down to below 1.8. What's going on in the US right now? They're trying to make the last abortion clinic illegal in a particular state. I look at generations, so I just thought I'd show you this just to break up the graphs, but you're going to get some more graphs in a minute. If you want to consider the speed of change of these things, you've got to not think in decades, but think of generations. Things really, really change over generations. This is my best estimate to actually put some limits on generations based on the life table and fertility records in England. Let's just work out the audience. So, if you were born between 1901 and 1928, inclusive, your generation phi. Have we got any generation phi people? Nope. If you were born between 1929 and 1955, inclusive, your generation W. Any generation Ws? Come on, Sally. Oh, well done. If you're born between 1956 and 1981, I've got you as Generation X, a little bit earlier than before, I'm Generation X, well done. Between 1982 and 2011, you're Generation Y. Williams, thank you. Youngsters. And I guess we don't have any Zs, 2012, I'm estimating 2042. Anyway, I do a lot about trying to look at those generations. The first of those generations saw the first tractors arrive in the fields. You'd be amazed at the change that's happened over these 5 generations. These 5 generations have seen change that 5 generations have never seen before of human beings. There have been single generations that have seen the Black Death arrive, or the plague, or an earthquake wipe out Lisbon. That's a single generation. These 5 generations have seen absolutely everything alter and alter again, so that your fundamental beliefs about the world have changed for the next generation. From going to thinking you're going to burn in hell if you say a naughty word, through to believing that the robots really are going to take over. It's incredibly fast. I go back to generation A and 1. You can take these generations back before 1066. Anyway, there they are. Just to give you a sense of the speed of change. The biggest change happened for Queen Elizabeth's generation. The really big one. Electricity coming everywhere. Sewage systems just proliferating. My generation, not much change. And I know this is not what the common narrative is. But I fly in 747s. The 747 first flew when I was born. I'm 51 years old. I used a Windows computer as a teenager. RISC OS system produced by Acorn. I'm geeky. I still use a Windows computer system. It is the kind of lifeblood of universities to pretend, to pretend that we are constantly making new brilliant discoveries, and you never know what graphene's going to do next. Or AI was a big thing in 1968. I had a lot about AI in my PhD thesis in 1991 about how it wasn't working. Right? Pattern recognition's got really good. Pattern recognition allows you to see phases, it allows you to translate. People talk about lawyers losing their jobs because of artificial intelligence. That won't be why lawyers lose their jobs, or accountants. By some estimates, we have more lawyers and accountants working in this country than the whole of the rest of the continent combined. If you don't want to have lots of lawyers and accountants, there are ways to do it without AI. And you've got to ask, why on earth would you create an increase in AI? America, by the way, beats us. So I'm an AI skeptic. I know I'm probably in the wrong place to say it. Prove me wrong. Maybe I'm just old. More graphs. Let's do more of these birds. China, that's the Chinese data, and it is dramatic and it has a huge effect on the world picture. Zooming in to the most recent years, very tiny rise, 1.6 children per woman to 1.61, 1.62. The reports of 2017, 2018, that has now slowed down again. But you know that China is slowing down. What you may not know is if we take the countries of the world with the highest fertility rates in each continent, it's dramatic. This is Niger, the highest fertility rate in Africa. Look at what is thought to have happened between 2000 and 2016 in Niger. And that's the current area with the highest fertility rate, I think, in the world. East Timor. Wars are bad news. being invaded by another country is bad news. You really want to avoid wars and pandemics and so on. But even East Timor now is heading below 5.5 and plummeting down. Guatemala, the country in South America with the highest fertility rate at the moment of only 3 children per woman. Even with wars, terrorism, insurrection, the United States, even then you manage to get slowed down. Haiti, highest fertility rate in the Caribbean. And again, sometimes when these patterns are too smooth, it suggests that the estimates are a bit dodgy, I suspect. But you never know, it's hard to know. But Haiti, heading rapidly down towards just 2 children. Fertility across the whole Caribbean, well below 2 in many parts. France, and at various points I put on things about access to abortion because it does matter, and the UK. And okay, you probably know those, but we've gone from something to something else in a generation. How many children you're expected to have, whether people will worry about you having too many. I've started putting loads on now. This is Korea, Portugal, and Brazil. The countries are absolutely plummeting. In Korea now, they're bringing people's grandmothers into the primary schools because they need somebody to sit at a desk in the primary school. And often the grandmothers are illiterate. So why not teach the grandmother as well as the child how to read? Because then the child has somebody to read with, and there aren't enough children in Korea. For those of you who like numbers, these are the numbers. I've highlighted just 3 in red. So if you're very fast, you can look at all the rest, but the 3 in red is the current total fertility rate in the whole of the continent of Africa. 2015, 4.7, 2016, 4.6, 2017, 4.5. I wanted to give you something that was kind of new and current and not known. And that incredible acceleration in the rate of slowdown in Africa at the moment and trying to work out why is particularly interesting. Exactly the same numbers in a minute, but just the changes. They're all negative, apart from China. And China's never going to get up to 2 children again, the way things are going. And highlighting in particular, these are the changes each year recently across Africa. So total human beings are slowing down, but I've got to wrap up because you've got to ask questions and you want to know about more things than just people. GDP, world GDP. And again, I'd ask you to look from 2006 to 2018. Ignore 2008. I think it's leaning off that way. That's GDP. Let's go forward. GDP in China, which you'll know from reports at the moment is slowing down. Bloomberg say the Chinese data can now be relied upon. We think it is. United States, not so much, but maybe. And you can look at, of course, all the countries of the world in this way by the GDP numbers that they report to the IMF. Earnings, US medium earnings. Now about $355 a week for somebody lucky enough to have a full-time permanent job. It's not very much. Appears to be stabilising. Interest rates, of course, used to be very low 200 or 300 years ago. They're very low again. We think it's temporary, but it carries on. Maybe not in this country. We might be able to engineer a situation by the 31st of October where the Bank of England has to desperately raise interest rates to defend the pound. But other than that, we seem to have entered a new era. House prices. I promised you something about this. The world's longest house price series, as far as I know, is the series about a particular canal in Amsterdam, where, of course, prices, because they are everywhere, stable. That's what stability looks like over a house price series that goes from 1628 and ended in 1973. In that period, there was 200 years where in real terms the prices fell. Amsterdam at the start was the most expensive part of Europe for house prices. Where is now the most expensive part of Europe for house prices? Welcome to Oxford. We actually beat London for the average person with 17 times average incomes. You think, oh, they can never fall in Oxford. They always eventually fall. Here's the UK house price data going to 2017. One of those graphs is absolute, one is relative, and the relative one, you can see that moving towards slow down faster. The highest rate of house price rises were the 1970s. For those of you who can remember the 1970s, my mum and dad bought a house for 400 quid in Cowley. 6 years later, a bit late, more 8 years later, they bought one for £21,000 in Risinghurst. Because the one in Summertown was £22,000. My mum and dad were never good economists. I would be a millionaire now if they hadn't. Anyway, you don't have to worry about this anymore. There is nobody to buy houses in future at usually inflated prices, so none of you are going to get rich on buying a house now. Price of gold is really interesting, based almost entirely on speculation, fear and worry, and a bit on selling jewellery, and a little bit about connections in computers, but that's less needed. That's where it is. Stocks and shares. Imagine that you were a trader in 1996 looking at the NASDAQ. You'd be amazed. And then, of course, you can see the dot-com crash. In fact, 2 dot-com crashes in it. And there we are. This data is only about a week old, 2019. What do you think is happening with the NASDAQ? There isn't a fortune-telling thing in any of this. This is just looking at the numbers, in this case, averaging them over an entire year to get them smooth enough and having a look. Unbelievable change. A century ago, 1 in 10 of the children of the servant-keeping classes died before they reached age 5. That's why we're paranoid about child death. Right? It's an amazing change that we've gone through. Things really can change. The big fear of my teenage years here was, when was I going to be annihilated in a nuclear war? And okay, we've got a lot of the weapons still to go, but that is the best estimate of the drop-in warheads from the worst times of the 1980s through to now. And the same with climate change. It is not impossible to change. Almost at the last graph, this is propensity to marry. And you go from one system in the 1970s, when my mum and dad, 1960s, when they got married, and then you get this sudden drop to it actually becoming a choice to marry now. It wasn't really a choice, you had to marry then. Now you can choose to marry. And so you can draw these diagrams in that way and see dramatic changes. Politics, I think, is the most fascinating one for a slowdown. This was the most dramatic change in polling in Britain ever, for every single poll we've ever had. This is the rise of support for Labour in February, March, April, but particularly May and June 2017. The biggest, fastest change in the politics of the people of Britain. The meant that Theresa May couldn't form a majority government that year. That was the most exciting change until the bloody Brexit Party came along. And I really don't want to put a graph of the Brexit Party in the book, unless they absolutely plummet, in which case it's going in. But just to try and share with you the agony of thinking about these things. Do you think politics is slowing down? How many isms have we invented recently? Is socialism that different from other kinds of socialisms or Chartism? Is there a new one? Environmentalism, well, we had that well before the 1960s and 70s. You could claim Thatcherism as a specialism, but that's 79, 80. I don't think there are many new ideas, but I could be getting old. A great worry I have with all of this is that once you can measure something, it's slowing down. The example I give you is disease. With almost all diseases in Britain, if you plot the chances of you getting a disease, it drops over time. Because one of the key things about curing a disease is actually knowing it is a disease. And once you recognise it as tuberculosis, it generally means you can do something about it. There's only one exception, which is cancer. The actual rates of people dying from cancer rose after we identified cancers. But that is now falling. So I have a worry, and I'm trying to gear you up for questions. I have a worry that the reason I'm finding everything slowing down is that things we get good enough to be able to measure, by the time we get good enough to measure them, are slowing down. I stuck in a picture of swimming pools in California just to tell me that I had to stop talking. We really do need to slow down. They're death traps. They don't particularly make you happy. You may think a swimming pool is a lovely thing to have, but you certainly don't need so many. You could go round and talk to the neighbours and use their swimming pool. And then you wouldn't have to try and fill them all up with a diminishing quantity of water. There are lots of good reasons to think we're slowing down. The last graph I've put up is the CO2 one because it is depressing. And that's the one we need to slow down the most. But nice and simple, bloody nice and simple. We're so lucky. Absolute linear relationship between CO2 and other carbon gases and temperature. You know, for largely a numerate world population, luckily kind of God decided, let's make this one easy for you to understand. The final graph is from colleagues in Japan who've been drawing these graphs for 20 years. This graph happens to be of the growth of Tokyo, and whether Tokyo is growing at the edges or in the middle, or at the edges in the middle, goes round and round and round, settles on the middle, because Tokyo stopped changing. Because what slowdown means is you stop changing. Population stops rising, you carry on living in the same places you've been living before, with much the same things that you had before, and for the first time, we get what we've had for most of human history. We get two generations who experience a very similar life. Have the same number of children, the same kind of clothes, the same expectations, same living standards. That's where we appear to be heading. Thank you ever so much for your patience.
Thanks, Annie. That was great. I saw the number of slides you had, and I didn't think you'd get through it, so congratulations. Do we have some questions? Who would like to go first? One over there.
Sure, thank you. You said in passing at some point that if population continues to go down, that's a good thing because we'll be happier in 2100. Assume for the sake of argument, just purely hypothetical, that climate change is solved tomorrow by some ingenious method. Would you still say that?
I'm a real optimist, so I think you could actually, if you were well organised, deal with 15 billion people on the planet. But those people who do worry, you can certainly calm them down. So all the people who worry about too many people, and there are a lot, I think they'd be happier. There are better ways to get happier than worrying about migrants, though. The worst thing to do is live in an area where migrants don't come. I've lived in places where migrants don't come. It's miserable. I am not too worried about whether we have 5 billion people on the planet or 15 billion. Currently, we have 1 billion people who behave so badly, they contribute by far the bulk of all that carbon. So I don't tend to worry about population numbers. But it's interesting what you could do in a more stable world. We're getting more and more wilderness at the moment. There are actually more places to go away, to get away from everybody else, because people are still coming off the land into cities. Cities are great for their urban heat islands. They kind of self-heat from our bodies. There's a hell of an air conditioning system working in this room, and you'd know about it if there wasn't one today. But I don't think the population level is that important. It's just the most easy one to demonstrate slowdown. If I was to show you the speed of semiconductors and so on, well, A, it's a lot more boring, and then we'd have a whole argument about what the hell is that semiconductor being used for. It's really hard to measure technological change. I'm very sceptical. The papers I've read that I believe the most say the 1930s was the period of fastest, before the war, of fastest technological change. But we don't actually have a measure. You could do the same with drugs. You know, drugs, measure them by what they've achieved, and then say, so what we've invented in the last 10 or 20 years, given how many more people we have researching drugs than ever on the planet, it doesn't compare well to the easy wins at the start. But once you get into an argument, you tend to defend it to the hilt. There is a danger. There must be things other than temperature which are accelerating still that I have just not thought of.
So a question there and then one over there.
Thank you very much for that presentation and the impressive number of graphs, which I don't think I've ever seen so many, certainly in my discipline. What, in your view, then underpins this evolutionary change, this reduction, and are the same changes, same processes and principles driving the increase in global warming as well? So is there a unifying principle that you see, or principles, that are leading to these changes?
It's industrialization that drives global warming, and it happened earlier, and it also happened in China a lot earlier, but then they called a halt to it, and this is centuries ago. The reason for why the acceleration took off in the first place is difficult to tie down, and probably related to the invasion of the Americas, and then the growing wealth of Europe as a result, and then you begin to see Europe is the place that produced the most babies early on that then flooded the rest of the planet. The deceleration is much easier to understand because we can get data, and it's women getting power. It is the revolution from women in this place being subhuman a century ago. You can't possibly have them studying with us men because we're the clever ones, to when the figures are released in 2 weeks' time, for the first time ever, the University of Oxford will be solidly majority female undergraduate. Right? It's taken us a long time. It's a slow university, this one. But that change in a century from seeing women as subhuman to women being a long way on to equal power. The average woman in the world wants half a child less than the average man, and the average woman in the world now gets her way, as opposed to the past. And you can talk about education and so on, but above all else, it's that. Why that happened, I don't, that's beyond me, but I can tie it down to the changing position of women. The other thing to say, which is a bit trite, is something had to happen. This is a change, it's temporary. We think of it as an era we live in. Right? We think of it as a mode of production. We call it the capitalist mode of production because we like to think that we're in something that's a bit stable. But it isn't, it's a change from one thing to another. And for 5 generations, we've been on a runaway train. And for the first few generations, that train was going faster and faster and faster. And what's happened right now is that somebody's slammed the brake on, and it feels really bad because we're used to moving forward. We think we should get a new kind of invention, a new TV set. We should be able to press a button and teleport somewhere else in the future because the rate of change was so fast in the past that when that ends, when you've still got a washing machine and a tumble dryer and nobody's invented the box that will iron your clothes yet, things really have slowed down. And they tell you GDPs are going to hardly rise. Your children aren't going to be better off than you. We think it's a terrible thing. Well, obviously it has to happen at some point. But you can't. All I do is look at data, try to make sure it's correct, draw it in a particular way, and keep on seeing graphs of things slowing down. You just have to say, it really, really is slowing. And not only is it slowing, in the last few years, the speed of slowdown has accelerated.
Thanks. Gentleman at the beard. Could you use some... Sorry, is there a microphone there?
During the period of growing population, we had rapid urbanization as well. From your figures, do you know if urbanization is affected by this slowdown? More people live in the countryside now?
No. The world's still urbanizing. And there is a tiny... I actually start the book off with this. I start the book off with a couple of couples, actually ones I know. One who's moved to live in Lesbos and another Japanese couple who've moved further. Because there's this kind of rural idyll idea of some of the young, of we want to go and live in a village in the middle of nowhere. They are really rare, thank God. because if many, many other people had their dream, all their dreams would be ruined. So for every couple that moves away to the rural island, another 100 are coming into the city. But as we head towards being an 80% urbanised world for Generation Z, it will stop. There have to be some people out, and some people want to be out in the countryside to go. I think the rate of urbanisation is now slowing, but it's one of those kind of cheaty things, because anything that can only ever get to 100% has to slow. So it's hard, but it is certainly slowing, but we are still urbanising. And the young really want to be, if you give them a choice, in cities around the world as far as we can see. So rural Japan is old Japan, but it's kind of stopped at this point. And there are, luckily, enough young people who will move to villages in the middle of nowhere up in the north of Japan to actually help keep the village going, because you can't just keep villages going by retirees moving in. That's what happens in this country. Retirees move into Devon villages, and you do need somebody under 60 in the village.
I know there are lots of questions, and I'm sorry, we just have time for one more over there.
Thank you very much. My question is about female empowerment. How do you measure women's education, and do you actually analyse a lag between the achievement of education and then decline in population? The second question is, I'm absolutely racking my brains in person because I can't remember the name of the social demographer who triggered a big debate about decline in South Asia about 35 years ago. But the argument was not that it was female education, but that it was social security. It was state interventions which reduced the risk of children dying.
Yeah.
Once those interventions are in place, then women can have fewer children. And so it's not necessarily women's decision either, it's a male and female decision.
Yeah, you're right. So, not too long an answer, but you're right. My grandmother, when she got Alzheimer's, would talk endlessly about babies under cushions, because she comes from an era where babies died. We are now, in this country, we have an infant mortality rate of 3.6 per thousand. It's actually rising tragically, but it's only 3.6. In the best parts of the world, it's just 2. You can have a single child and expect that single child to outlive you. And it's the first time. You'd be really unlucky. And that really changes your behaviour or something. Education we measure now by the number of days or years spent in secondary education and the numbers who are graduating from universities. And the majority of graduates in the world are now female. But that's the way in which we measure it. But you are also very right that when you see increases in fertility, it's partly when you need to have more children for your own social security later in life, when things fall apart. Because you hope one of them will look after you. And when you can rely on the state and think that the state will look after you, and particularly somebody who will be provided to wash your body in the last year of your life, then you can have fewer to do it. So creating that situation is just as important as the increased education that's there. But the wonderful, magical thing is going from a situation in which most people would see one of their children die before reaching adulthood to a situation in which that is almost completely unknown. And the great irony in our Leave It With You is we still have the inbuilt fear and paranoia that you need to deal with those circumstances. And the tragedy is we now transfer that fear about what can I do so that my child doesn't die to how am I going to get them to get an A star in their GCSE? And the A star in the GCSE really, really doesn't matter. But the gut feeling of absolute paranoia about your children comes from the time when they could die. And we've got to somehow learn to calm down and realise that they're almost certainly going to be okay.
Thanks very much. So thanks again for Danny for a really fascinating talk, and go away and plot all your graphs as phase diagrams rather than against time. And just a reminder that next week we have Diana Coyle who will be speaking, so do come along to the next in our series of Evolving Economic Thought. Join me by thanking Danny again.